Good morning and welcome to episode number 50 of the Anno Domini podcast. I am so proud of myself. As I always tell you guys, it is so different. Last night I was ministering to my beloved friends from Andrew's Kingdom's Gate Church. And it is so different when you can interact with people and love on them and see their faces, their smiling faces, or their concerned faces, depending on what you're talking about. And here I cannot see any of you, so I feel after 50 episodes, uh, a little bit still awkward to talk to a machine, this thing that we call camera, this thing that we call laptop, surrounded by paraphernalia here, technological paraphernalia, right? But again, here we go. I am enjoying doing this as a way of reaching out to you every morning with a message from my heart, from the Nehemiah School of Government, and in this new phase for what the Lord has proposed or has brought for us to do here in the United States of America. And next month, no, we're still in August, October, we're going to be celebrating our 8th anniversary as a family here in this nation of covenant. We are so glad, and we are most of all, above anything else, we're so grateful for the Father to have sent us to serve this nation, to serve this local community, Midland, Odessa, Andrews, and wherever the Lord sends us. We've been walking through the eschatology of Israel. We started last week, and we have been diving this week specifically on what I have been calling the eschatology of Israel, meaning that God, in his eternal plan, had two players in mind. He had in mind that the most important day in human history would be what we call Good Friday, meaning the day Jesus was crucified and buried, the day that he died for our sins, the day that he imputed to himself, brought to himself the guilt and the wrath that was supposed to come over all of us, on all of us. And Jesus was the one that really marked his birth, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, his ascension. This period of time, comprised of around 30-something, 32, 33 years, they were the epitome, they were the marker between an eschatology, a history of a people, the covenant people, Israel, that ended in Jesus in his lifetime. And he was the beginner, the opener of this new book, let me rephrase that. It was not a new book. It was the same book. We are just a continuation, the second part or the second chapter of this book that now is called Kingdom. On the first portion of the book, Israel only was the chosen people, those chosen to minister from God to the planet and from the planet to God. They were the mediators. They were those people, and especially the tabernacle, the priests, the high priest, all of those ceremonies, all of those rituals were the point of connection. And later the temple, right? When they entered the land, the promised land, now there is a temple, not only a moving tabernacle, but the temple. And they were the ones responsible to bring God's promises, God's blessings, or God's punishments, God's judgments from heaven, passing through them to the people. They were to serve as God's representatives and standards, patterns here on this planet. And when Jesus comes, he establishes something altogether different. Now, Jesus says that when he comes and tabernacles with us, John chapter 1 says that, the Gospel of John, he establishes a change in that process from an earthly tabernacle, from an earthly temple, from an earthly ceremony, or many ceremonies, from an earthly location where God would inhabit, dwell, and once a year, the high priest would go there and ask for the forgiveness of the sins of the nation. Now, Jesus is this tabernacle. Jesus now is this temple. And he comes and he dies, and the veil between men, ordinary people, and the Holy of Holies is torn from the upper part to the bottom part. God torns it down, rips it apart. And now the book of Hebrews says that we have free access to the throne of grace. And this is the moment when Jesus transforms each believer into a sanctuary, into the Holy of Holies, into those who are walking representations of Jesus and God's presence out there in the world. So Jesus establishes this second part or second chapter of this book called the kingdom. But we have been seeing throughout this week, we started on Monday this week, looking at how the history of Israel was supposed to be temporary, was supposed to end. And we are reading on chapters 21, 22, 23. We did it yesterday of Matthew. That everything that is going on is in a preparation for the end of the eschatology of that first portion of the book, first chapter, initial chapters of the book. And we're going now to chapter 24. And chapter 24 of Matthew, combined with the 13th chapter of Mark and the 21st chapter of Luke, they all talk about the three gospels. The three writers talk about the same things, the same thing, the end of the eschatology of Israel. The problem for us here 2,000 years later is, once again, I'm beating this drum throughout the week, when we mix the eschatology of Israel with the eschatology of the kingdom. And everything that we're going to be reading on chapter 24, if we fix our minds, if we focus our attention, and we understand that all that we are reading on chapter 24, everything that Jesus is saying and Matthew is writing about, if we understand that all of that is related only to the eschatology of Israel, we're going to have a massive opening in our minds to understand the message that Jesus is recording to all of us today, 2,000 years later. Now, before I go to chapter 24 of Matthew, am I saying that nothing that is inside of this chapter does not apply after that, is not applicable to Christians on the 2nd century, the 5th century, the 10th century, or today, 2,000 years ago, wars and rumors of wars? Of course it does. That is the secondary applications that can be seen throughout the entirety of human history. For example, John writes his 7 letters from Jesus. He writes 7 letters to 7 churches, specific, as I mentioned before, 7 churches with a specific zip code in specific countries, in specific territories, geographic territories, right? All those 7 cities today are located in one country, one nation called Turkey. All 7 of them: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Laodicea, and all the 7 of them are today located physically, geographically, territorially located in a nation called Turkey. But the contents of each one of those letters to the 7 churches were written specifically to 7 churches that John would be a shepherd of. He pastored, he took care of those 7 churches. And he was writing to them, to an audience that was living on that day, on his day. But those contents can be applied and employed and can represent churches throughout the ages. The same with the book of Matthew chapter 24. But the primary audience, the audience reference here is once again, you, especially on the second person plural. You guys that I'm talking to, you have a name right now. You have you live in a house in a certain address. You live in a certain zip code. I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you, spiritual leaders of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, of Israel right now. I'm talking to you. When Jesus says, woe to you, brood of vipers, he is not talking about people 2,000 years later, although there are many broods of vipers in our midst today, 2,000 years later. But Jesus is referring to directly in a target audience that he was talking to, engaging in a conversation with. So without further ado, let us go to chapter 24. I am not going to read the full chapter. You can do that at home. But I would like to highlight a couple of verses here to show you that chapter 24 is the crowning, or is crowning the conversation that started on chapter 21. I'm going to say that again. Chapter 24 is the crowning of a conversation that Jesus started with the disciples on chapter 21. And we have been following 21, 22, 23. Today we go to 24. Probably tomorrow I'm going to dive into 25. This is a sequence. There's no chapter and verse when Jesus is talking to them. There is no separation of chapters. It is just a story, a script that Matthew is writing about everything that Jesus was talking to the people in his own days, 2,000 years ago. So let's go to chapter 24. Matthew starts by saying, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Jesus was in the temple. Remember that on chapter 21, he gets to the mount of the temple, Temple Mount, very close to the Mount of Olives, across from actually the Mount of Olives. The Temple Mount was the supposed place where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac. So it was called Mount Zion later by David. Okay, so that is where Jesus gets to with his disciples on chapter 21. He does everything that he does on chapters 21, 22, 23. And now he is departing that same temple. It is not a temple that will be built later on, 2,000, 3,000 years later. No, Jesus is talking to them about that temple that was still standing. By the way, the temple that Herod had greatly expanded. Majestic temple, that temple. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of that temple. The disciples say, Jesus, now that we are getting far away, we're distancing ourselves physically from the temple. Look back. Look at how beautiful this temple is. Look how majestic this temple is. Jesus' response to them, Jesus said, do you not see all these things? Don't you see the beauty of this temple? Don't you see? Or you're just showing me. Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown out. And that is the moment when the disciples say, wait, what? No way, right? I mean, this is so majestic. Nothing can make this thing be destroyed. This is so big. This is so massive. These stones are so so big, so strong, it can take whatever comes against it, right? But Jesus says, no, it's coming down. Not one stone will be on top of the other. Everything will come down. And I can imagine the shock of the disciples when they heard that. But let's keep going. So that's verses 1 and 2. Let's jump to verse 6. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Stop right here. This is something that we hear a lot about today, right? Well, look at Russia and Ukraine. Look at Israel and Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran. Look at all the wars around the world. Jesus is clearly talking about us now. No, Jesus is not talking about us now. That can have secondary applications and had many times in 2,000 years. And as long as human history endures, there will be wars and rumors of wars going on all around all the time. But at this moment in time, at this specific moment in time when Jesus is talking to his disciples close to the year 30, Anno Domini 30, there was what we call the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. There were no wars. Everything was under the control of the empire. Everything was very dramatically by force, by brute force, by the Roman military. Everything was kept in place. Everything was controlled, under control. Every now and then there were some explosions, some turmoil, some social unrest and upheavals every now and then here and there. But the military of Rome would come and quash and just squelch that and stop that, because it was the moment of the Pax Romana. And because of the Pax Romana, because of the peace of Rome everywhere, the gospel was able to go to all places. It was exactly because of the Pax Romana that the gospel was able to thrive and prosper and multiply everywhere. The streets and the roads of Rome were paved. They were allowed displacement from one place to another very quickly. So the gospel spreads like wildfire. Why? Because that area is in peace. It is a forced peace. It is a peace by force, by the imposition of the brute force of the Roman Empire. But there was peace. Pax in Latin means peace. The peace of Rome was everywhere. This is the moment when Jesus is telling the disciples, you see this peace? You are going to start listening to and hearing about rumors of wars and wars once again. So this is very important. But Jesus says, the end of verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled by that, for all these things must come to pass. But look at what Jesus says, but the end is not yet. End of what? End of human history 2,000 years later? No, the end of the Israel's eschatology is not yet. And we know that the end happened 40 years after Jesus was saying these words, with the destruction of Jerusalem, the walls, and the temple by the Romans. So he says the end is not yet. There are things that need to happen before the end of the eschatology of Israel comes. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. If you know that, for those who do, for those who don't, you will know now that Rome would conquer nations, but Rome would not take the label or the identity of the nation away and put another label, Roman Empire. They would allow nations to keep their names. They would even allow kings of conquered nations to be in their places as kings, as long as they paid the taxes and as long as they did not cause any trouble. By the way, this is what Rome did with Israel, right? In the Judaic wars, in around 160 before Christ, there was an uprising of the Jews, the Jewish people, in what's the name of the Maccabean War. So Maccabee means hammer. So it was a specific family of leaders, Jewish leaders, that waged war against everything around them, including Rome, and they conquered the identity and the independence of Israel once again. That was 160 to 114, 110 before Christ. So the Romans did not come and conquer them and label their small world, this is part of the Roman Empire. No, they allowed them to be Israel. They allowed them to be independent as long as they paid their due taxes, and they did not cause any trouble. And there was an agreement between the leaders of the Jewish leaders back then and the Roman leaders back there in Rome, and they cohabited. They lived together, knowing each one their own role in the whole system on this agreement. So when Jesus says nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, this was unheard of in the time of the disciples, or at least this had not happened for a long time. Now Jesus is saying, the nations, the kingdoms that Rome has conquered and has allowed them to continue as individual kingdoms, individual nations, this is going to end to exist. Because you are going to see these nations raging war against other nations, and even the Roman Empire, and kings and kingdoms will rise against other kingdoms. So the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, will end. Jesus is saying, he is prophesying that, and every single prophecy that he released with his mouth was fulfilled. So that's what we're talking about, the end of the eschatology of Israel. Verse 7, Jesus says, there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Do you remember that there was an earthquake when Jesus died? And when he delivered his spirit to the Lord, the word of God says that there was an earthquake. There was another earthquake in the book of Acts. There was a famine in the book of Acts so dramatic to the point that Paul goes out to the neighbor nations and collect money and food to bring to the Jews, to the Christian Jews that were living in Jerusalem. Remember that? That's in the book of Acts. This is a fulfillment of what Jesus was prophesying here. You will see and you will hear of earthquakes and pestilences and famines. And the book of Acts shows that Jesus was correct and he was faithful to fulfill everything that he had talked about. Verse 11, there will be many false prophets. Oh my goodness, look at the book of Acts. Look at the epistles of Paul, the epistles of John. There were false prophets everywhere, fulfilling Jesus's prophecy here in Matthew 24 before he died. Verse 13, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. I talked about this yesterday. To the end of what? Not to the end of the world 2,000 years later or 5,000 years later. To the end of the Judaic era. To the end of the eschatology of Israel. Those who will remain faithful will be saved. And the end came in 70 AD with the complete destruction of Jerusalem. And those who took heed to Jesus's words were saved. And the end of the chapter 24 of Matthew is going to tell us how that salvation came. Let me keep going. 14, Matthew 24, 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world to all the nations as a witness. I mentioned about this yesterday. It doesn't mean the final effort to take the gospel to all the nations 2,000, 5,000 years later. Jesus was talking about the nations that existed at that point in time. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And Jesus is saying, when you read it, you will understand the book of Daniel. Jesus says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That was the salvation. When you see the abomination of desolation, and it would take me a long time to explain what the abomination of desolation is here specifically. So I am going to bring to you Luke chapter 21. When Luke is writing, remember that Luke is a doctor, and he is writing to an audience that is not a Jewish audience. Matthew has in mind a Jewish audience. They understand what abomination of desolation means. Jesus had already told the Jewish leaders that their house would be desolate. This is the desolation Jesus was talking about. But Luke is writing to a Gentile, especially Greek audience, that would not be familiar with the expression abomination of desolation. So Luke writes what? When you see the city of Jerusalem under siege, when you see the city surrounded by armies, flee to the mountain. So the salvation that Jesus talks about in verse 13 of Matthew 24, he who endures to the end shall be saved. That salvation could be achieved by foot, on foot, leaving the city when they saw the surrounding armies sieging the city of Jerusalem. And many Christians 40 years later remembered Jesus's words here in Matthew 24. These words are 40 years before the Roman army circle and surround Jerusalem and kill everybody that was inside. According to Flavius Josephus, a Jewish writer or historian, and Tacitus, General Tacitus, on the side of the Roman army, around close to 1 million Jews were slaughtered in 5.5 months, which is exactly, by the way, the same amount of time that John in the book of Revelation talks about this event, 5.5 months, or 42 weeks, 42 in total. So my math might not be correct here, but I will go to the book of Revelation tomorrow. So guys, the word of God is faithful. Everything that is written, everything that Jesus talked about in chapter 24 of Matthew was fulfilled if we understand that he was talking about the eschatology of Israel. Let me just keep going a couple of more verses here. Verse 21, for then, when all of this happens, there will be great tribulation. What is this great tribulation? It's referred, we might not know what it is, but we know that it is referred to a time-bound chronological date, the end of the eschatology of Israel. That is what the Great Tribulation is talking about. Can we say that the Great Tribulation will never happen again after this, or never happened again after this? Of course not. Of course not. One thing that I always talk about when I engage in conversations with my futurist Christian friends, when they say, well, this Great Tribulation is still to happen in the future, I always say, how are you going to explain to a Christian man, a Christian family, a Christian woman, a Christian community living today in North Korea? They have been brutalized for over 60 years now. They cannot live in liberty to express their faith in their God. When they are caught with a Bible or preaching or talking about Jesus, they are brutally tortured and publicly tortured and killed. How are we going to express to them that the Great Tribulation is still coming? How are we going to express or explain to Christians in Nigeria? Nigeria today is #1 country where the persecution is ravaging the country. The #1 most powerful and most brutal persecution in the world, where the most brutal persecution is happening. How are we going to explain to them? I mean, Christians are being burned alive on the streets of cities in Nigeria. How are we going to explain to them that no, something even greater a greater tribulation than that is coming. So we mix that and we cause a lot of confusion, because Jesus is talking about verse 21, great tribulation here. He is referring to the Christians that were living on that, in that generation. Okay? It facilitates it. It makes everything easier to understand. Verse 27, I'm jumping here quickly. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. Yesterday I was driving back from Andrews to Midland, and there was a storm on the northern area of Andrews. And as I was driving south back to Midland, I could see it on the back of my on my mirror, back mirror, and I saw the lightnings behind me. And guys, we don't see a standardized or a patternized type of lightning. Lightnings do not start in the east and go to the west, or necessarily from the north to the south. Lightning starts wherever and they go wherever. Like, the patterns are not the same. They go everywhere from everywhere, right? So what would be the best word here instead of lightning? This is a translation that does not make that it's not fair to the text. So the lightning that comes from the east and flashes to the west, the lightning comes from anywhere and goes to anywhere. There is no standard to that. But there is one thing that is born in the east and always ends in the west every single day. That's the sun. So Jesus is talking here about, let us translate here, for as the sun comes from the east and flashes to the west, starts in the east and ends in the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. That will be much easier to understand. The Son of Man and his coming will be like the sunrise and the sundown. Something will start and something will end. So I could go deeper here, but I just wanted to bring you this snippet here so you can think about that. It is much easier to think about a day, sunrise and sunset, than a lightning, right? So I wanted to bring this to your attention this morning for your meditations. Verse 28, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. What is carcass? What is corpses, right? And why eagles? There are some other translations that say vultures, but the correct one is eagles. Eagle was the symbol of the Roman Empire, of the Roman military, especially the Roman army, right? And when Jesus talks about corpses, he talks about those who would die inside of the city of Jerusalem when the Roman army attacked them. So where the corpses are, the vultures, the birds of prey, the eagles will be there. Easier to understand? Eschatology of Israel. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation, immediately after those days when your generation will see that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Well, if one star, one small star, gets close to the atmosphere of the planet Earth, we know what happens. Everything enters into collapse. Everything collapses, right? So Jesus is not talking here about physical, astronomical, celestial stars and sun and moon here. He is talking about spiritual powers, and he is talking about nations' powers. If you go to Isaiah, I could just dive into this right now by going back to the book of Isaiah chapter 13. The same words that prophet Isaiah uses as a harbinger for Babylon, as a judgment sentence over Babylon, the prophet Isaiah says to Babylon, the sun, the moon, the stars will fall upon you, is the same expression, same words that Jesus uses here now for Jerusalem. This is a figurative type of language. This is symbolic type of language. The powers of the heaven, the spiritual powers, the principalities and powers, those who rule over you will fall. This is not talking about physical or astronomical upheaval. It's talking about spiritual and national upheavals. So again, I could just dive into this text here and show you. Let me show you something else. When Joseph has the dreams, remember that he had a dream that the sun, the moon, and 12 stars were bowing before him. Were literal sun, moon, and stars bowing before him? No, he was talking about the representations of what was going to be Israel, the nation of Israel. And what happens when he comes to power, when Pharaoh listens to his interpretation of the dream, Pharaoh makes him the second in his kingdom. And now the peoples of Israel, those people who were out there, including his own family, comes and bow before him. So it is not the physical, the astronomical, the celestial bodies that Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about he's talking in a symbolic language. Okay, let me see if I have any other thing here. Okay, 34, assuredly I say to you, this generation will not pass by no means until all of these things happen. So I'm going to wrap up here today by allowing you to go back home, or you are at your place right now, pick up your Bible and read the entirety of chapter 24. And let me wrap up before I end. I'm going to repeat this one more time. I am not saying that any of this was not supposed to happen again. I am not saying that these texts could not be repeated during and throughout 2,000 years of history. I am not saying that. What I am saying is that in order for Jesus to be faithful to his words, and we know that every single word that he said was fulfilled, all of this had to happen, and it did. Everything happened because he could not lie. Jesus did not lie. Our problem is, our challenge, let me change that word. Our challenge here is to understand what Jesus was talking about, what people he was talking to, what place he was talking at, to what audience, target audience reference, geography reference, who he was talking to, about what he was talking about. He was talking about the end of that chapter in God's big book, right? The eternal book of God, the script that God had created. First, the player was Israel. And when Jesus comes, he inaugurates another chapter, and now it's the kingdom. So we must not mix those things that are related to Israel in the sense that they had a fulfillment of everything that they were supposed to be doing, their assignment, their mission, their role in the world. And now this new Israel, composed of Jews and Gentiles, come into play. And they are the ones that are going to bring Jesus back, the new Israel, the new covenant in the blood of the Lamb. May God bless you. And I hope that you can go back to the Word of God and do this exercise. Go to Matthew 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, and you will see that Jesus is referring to that generation with applications being possible throughout the ages. But these words were primarily addressed to those people of that time in order for Jesus's words to be fulfilled. Jesus is faithful. He is going to fulfill every single word before he returns to this planet. Not one I, not one dot will be left out of the fulfillment because of his faithfulness. May God bless you, and I hope to see you tomorrow for episode 51 of the Anno Domini podcast. See you there.